Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street's a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make your world a better place. Whether you're in business, an issue-based campaign, or an organisation driving change in a community, Dunn Street develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them to achieve common goals from the ground up. To find out ways in which Dunn Street can partner with you and make change in your local community, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello, my name is Stephen Donnelly and welcome to Episode 4 of Socially Democratic. It's a weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people that are leading them from home and abroad. On today's episode, we've got John McTernan. John was the former Director for Communications to Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister. And John is also a senior advisor to the Blair governments in the late 90s and early 2000s. John is joining us on the line from London today. And I will give you guys a word of warning. The audio on this isn't as good as I wanted it to be. We had some technical difficulties throughout. The internet was sort of dropping in and out, which is a little bit frustrating. I personally blame the federal Liberal government for not implementing the full Stephen Conroy NBN. Fibre to the node is not good enough. So that's the problems we had today. So please bear with us with the audio, and hopefully you can sort of tolerate it for this particular podcast. Next time we have someone from overseas or on the line, I guarantee it will be a much better sound. Also, don't forget that the podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts. If you do subscribe to Apple Podcasts, can you please give us a review and subscribe to the podcast? It'll help us with our rankings, and we'll try and see if we can get ourselves on the Apple Podcast new and noteworthy. But we're also on Spotify and Stitcher, and obviously on all the other sort of podcast apps that you use. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast to get all the updated episodes. I know that normally we do these episodes, try to get them up on a Monday or a Tuesday, but with the European elections on this week, we just held off until later in the week to try and let the dust settle and get John to give us a bit of an analysis of how the elections played out, in particular how the elections played out in Britain and the awful results that were for Labor up and down the country, from Land's End to John O'Groats. And also, don't forget, if you want to follow the podcast and for all the updates, just follow us at Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. But let's go to the interview that we did today with John McTernan. So we've had the European elections on Tuesday, Australian time. It is Thursday evening at 7:15, and that would be around about 9:45 in the morning, Britain time. And it's fantastic to have on Socially Democratic for the first time, but not the first time I've done a podcast with this great man, John McTernan. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Oh, it's great to be on.
We had the elections this week in Europe for all the parliamentary elections, and I was very keen to get you on to talk to you about the outcomes of those elections. But even before then, I actually wanted to get on the podcast to talk about Brexit. There's so much happening in Europe right now, so we have so much to get through. Let's talk about the European elections. Let's talk about what it means in terms of Britain. Let's talk about what it means in terms of the Labor Party in Britain, and then maybe later on in the podcast we can talk a bit about Brexit itself. But John, can you give us for the listeners to the podcast, give us a bit of an overview of the European parliamentary elections that happened this week, and the results across Europe for the left and the right, and what did you expect, and what were the outcomes?
So there was an obsession in the Anglosphere, definitely in the US papers, and I think a bit in Australian papers and social media too, with the notion that there was some right-wing populist tide going to surge across Europe, break the European model, break the European Union, break the political system. We'll come to Brexit and what that means in Britain, but expected tidal wave didn't come. You've got 20 to 25% of the the MEPs in the new European Parliament are going to come from, quotes, populist parties. But that's a populist range that goes from the populist left to the populist right. And for all that people believe in the horseshoe theory of politics, it's really hard to get the Pirate Party to work together with what was, Marine Le Pen's Front National. You obviously saw a big victory in Italy for Salvini, but everybody knew that was coming. That was priced in. You saw a fallback for the AfD in Germany. You did see, results in Poland and Hungary, which weren't as good for the opponents, the populists there. But again, that could probably be anticipated. And in France, you saw Marine Le Pen getting broadly the same vote that her party got in the last European elections, and you saw that Macron offers the only potential electoral alternative to that. From nowhere, his party came to virtually equal with the Front National. The Republican Party, the traditional Conservative Party in France, wrecked, ruined. The Socialist Party, for decades, the main left party, and particularly since the collapse of the Communist Party in France, the only organised left party, in ruins. And so what do you see with Macron? Macron has probably got the only political programme that can effectively combat the populists of the right. His muscular centrism is probably the way for political parties to go across Europe. And when you look at the results, the pattern of the results, you'd say across Europe you have got a globalized or a benefiting from globalized urban professional class who are liberal in social values, who are green and environmental in their attitudes. I think you and your listeners will understand that has a resonance for Australia, has a resonance in the US as well. When you look at the popularity of AOC and the Green New Deal and some of the ideas around that, and you see the battle between those two. And so, where's it going for left and right? The growth in European politics in terms of MEPs in the European Parliament is amongst the Liberals, small L Liberals, not the same as the Tory Liberals in Australia, and the Green parties. And so, what's the challenge? What I say? There's been a growth in support for progressive politics and progressive political parties. There's been a decline in support for traditional social democratic parties. The destruction of the socialists in France is one thing. The catastrophic collapse of the Social Democrats in Germany, one historically the largest of their parties, and also one of the largest social democratic parties in any kind of Western democracy. And what are the challenges for the traditional parties of the left and of the right? Again, I suspect this will have resonance for you and for listeners. That traditional right parties are being attacked from two directions. One is that the populist parties of the right are eating into their vote. But the second one, which is more difficult for them in the longer term, and those populist parties really organise around issues of identity, defensively, and the other issues for these parties of the right is that the middle class voters who used to traditionally fall into their camp and vote for them are becoming liberal in social values. Take equal marriage as a good example of that. Or take women's rights, equal representation of women in Parliament, those things which are still strangely a matter of dispute in some conservative political parties, and they're becoming more environmental. What does it mean for traditional social democratic parties? They are going to have to become greener, more liberal, because let's be clear, social democratic parties have not always been socially liberal. There's been a very strong socially conservative strand within them, and that's particularly comes from elements of the labour movement, which is itself at times socially democratic in organisation, but also quite defensive in social values and socially conservative. But it does mean that, I'll finish on this point really, it does mean that the opportunities for growth are really there at the progressive centre, with those liberal and green values meshed with traditional social democratic values. But the rise of the populists tells us another thing, which is that leadership matters in all of our political systems. Leadership matters, and charismatic leaders do better than those without charisma.
Who are the...
We'll come back to Jeremy Corbyn later.
We will indeed. Who are the people that tend to vote in mainland Europe in these particular elections? I did read that turnout was higher in this particular election. Is it the politically engaged that do turn out to vote, or
traditionally there are higher turnouts in Europe for the European Parliament elections because the countries which have joined the European Union, at whatever point, whether at the founding or in later expansions, or whether the post-Soviet independent countries who've joined, the post-Warsaw Pact countries, post-communist economies, they've kind of got more of a commitment to it than Britain, the reluctant joiner. And so we've always traditionally had a lot of turnouts, and it's healthy turnouts in the mainland European countries, and so it's kind of hard to say that it's not a minority sport. There's not compulsory voting, but people believe these elections matter about the future direction of Europe because for all kinds of reasons, for European countries, the unity of Europe economically and politically, democratically, and also in terms of security is really, really important because they still, very, very many countries in Europe, whether Spain or Portugal or Greece, have had relatively recent experience of dictatorship, and obviously Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, other countries have had even more recent experience of lacking democracy and even occupation. So I think there's less of a democratic deficit in mainland Europe than there is in the UK, and in the UK it really reflects participation, really reflects the deep ambivalence about Europe that came out in the Brexit referendum.
So let's turn our attention across the English Channel to Britain in these elections. Give us some context heading into these elections, because obviously we'll talk more about Brexit in a moment, but because of Brexit, I don't think certainly people who were on the Leave side of the argument considered even having to be contesting these elections in the first place. But things obviously haven't transpired in that way. Britain still remain members of the European Union and now have to contest these elections in which half the country arguably don't want to be a part of it in the first place. Give us some context about going into these elections, how all the respective parties pitched themselves to the electorate for these European elections.
So these were the elections that Britain wasn't meant to have. We were meant to have left the European Union by March the 29th, but faced with a menu of options for leaving, which ranged from the terrible to the appalling, the House of Commons MPs in the House of Commons decided to vote for none of the above. And we are therefore in a situation where we've got an extension to Britain's membership of the European Union, while the government tries to sort itself out by electing a new leader for the governing party, the Tories, and while the Commons tries to sort out what its options are, which are settling down, and we'll talk about this a bit more, to basically no deal or no Brexit. So the political parties went into it. The two main parties, Labour and Tory, both are in various ways Leave parties, but both quite compromised Leave parties. The Conservatives are a compromised Leave party because the withdrawal agreement that they agreed with the European Union, probably, in all honesty, the best deal that the UK could have got out of those negotiations. given the constraints put on the negotiations by Prime Minister Theresa May and by the realities of the Conservative Party, could not command a majority on the right of the House. So theoretically, the Northern Ireland Unionists, the Democratic Unionists, plus the Conservative Party is enough to furnish a slim majority for what the government wants to do. It turned out that certain technical issues, mainly around the island of Ireland, prevented the Unionists and prevented the right wing of the Tory Party waving through a withdrawal agreement. And so on their right emerged the Brexit Party with a really simple proposition, which is, says what does what it says on the tin. You vote for the Brexit Party, we're voting to leave. That's it. And the claim and the demand of the Brexit Party was, you voted to leave. Politicians are stopping this happening. Send them a message. We're going to leave. We have to leave. On the left, the Labour Party has got a party membership and voters who are 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 in favour of staying in the European Union. But a party leader in Jeremy Corbyn, who is a Eurosceptic who campaigned against joining Europe in the 70s and has never really settled to Britain's membership of what he regards as a capitalist club. And so the Labour Party has kind of always positioned itself as, yes, we have to leave. The vote went that way, but we need a better deal than the Tory government have negotiated. If we were a government, we'd negotiate a better deal. A deal for workers, a deal for jobs, a deal for the economy, which really isn't on offer because all Brexit's hurt the British economy to a lesser or greater extent. And the problem with the Labour position was it was sitting on the fence. And the challenge, the deep challenge politically is a referendum resets the realities of politics. It's what it did in Scotland, which after that referendum it divided the country into yes or no. An independence party, the SNP, which got all the support of the minority who voted for independence, and a range of unionist parties who split the vote between them, Labour, Lib Dems and the Scottish Conservatives. The same thing is really clear looking at the UK politics now. The only question in British politics is Brexit, and you have to have a position on that. And there's a binary. It's remain or leave. And the Labour Party ended up being seen as a kind of leave party. That field was contested. If you want to leave, you can vote Tory or Brexit.
It's fascinating that we stand here today in 2019 and we have a Labour Party in Britain that is ultimately a leave party. If you think back to the days of Blair and Brown and even before then, this is a party that has been about Europe. And now this is a sort of, going into this election, there is this quasi, as you said before, just sitting on the fence kind of arrangement. There's a question I was going to ask you much later in the podcast, but I think I'm going to bring it forward now because you and I have spoken about this off air previously when we've caught up. You have a thesis that ultimately, just like how Irish politics was defined from the establishment of the Irish Free State in the early 20s, that Irish politics is not a left-right dichotomy, but it is a pro-treaty, anti-treaty. That is, it is the politics in Ireland is defined by whether you supported an Anglo-Irish treaty that created the Irish Free State. That is Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. In British politics, it has always been a left-right politics, something that in Australia we're very, very familiar with. But your theory is that potentially going forward, that British politics will be defined by whether you are in favour of being in the European Union or not being in the European Union. Now, you and I had that conversation in 2016. Where are you with that theory right now, given that we've had multiple elections since then, and what is happening in terms of that theory?
I think the theory is being borne out, to be absolutely honest. A couple of reflections. One is Ireland shows you that deep conflicts, in the case of Ireland, one that actually was first an armed rising against the British and then was a civil war within Ireland, those conflicts take over a century to recover from. That simply is the reality, because you have to get to a point where everybody who is involved in that conflict, that fight, that struggle, has died. And you probably have to get to a point where most of their children have died as well, because it's still a mobilizing identity. And what's happening is the older generation who participated have died, like some people like my granddad and some of my great uncles, and then the generation of aunts and uncles have died, and gradually left with my mum's generation finally talking about what the elders did, and it finally seeps back into a discussion, because now it's long enough away to sort of normalize it, humanize it, and talk about it, and not valorize it. Now, obviously, the conflict in Britain over Remain and Leave is nothing of that scale. It's not a civil war, and it's not a situation which the Nigel Farages of this world threaten to go out on the streets and to don khaki and fight to liberate Britain. That is a mind populated by too many Saturday and Sunday afternoon World War II movies. But there is a reality of the identity that is created by the definitional and existential choice of a referendum. People chose an identity in Scotland over independence, and the yes identity is a very powerful one, and the no identity is not a powerful one. People chose to leave that as a very powerful identity. It has got a very, very rich mix of different forces within it. And the leave identity has always been in the debate and the disputes. Leavers will be angry if we don't leave. And what's happening in Britain is the creation of an identity I'd call angry Remainers. 6 million people, a record number, signed a petition, an online petition for the House of Commons calling for the revocation of Article 50, therefore stopping the withdrawal from the European Union. 1 million people went on a march in London. And the most striking thing about that march in London was this was Britain's professional middle classes of all ages and of all races on the march. And the number of them that wore around their necks, like football fans, the flag of the European community, the European Union, the blue flag with the yellow stars on it, in a way that an England fan might wear in England, it's George's Cross on their back, or a Scotland flag, St Andrew's Cross. And that has never happened before. That is a really interesting thing to see, a new identity being created on the streets of the country. And the question that is being posed in my mind is, yes, there's lots of angry leavers who voted for Nigel Farage. Angry Remainers are cashed up, networked socially, networked economically, skilled in communication, there's far better potential for organising a mass political movement, and one that can operate on the Remain side than on the Leave side. And in a way, you saw that in the referendum, which is not the referendum, sorry, in the European elections. You saw that when Labour didn't offer a sufficiently strong case to the country, it was punished everywhere. Worst election result in Wales since 1918. Worst election result in Scotland since 1910. And 1906 wasn't really an election the Labour Party stood in. It was one where there was candidates standing by agreement with the Liberal Party. So, worst election result in Scotland in history.
Talk us through the numbers about Scotland, just to give the listeners a bit of a concept of how bad the results were in Scotland.
Well, the Scottish Labour Party came below 10% of the poll, and the Remain vote all went for the SNP, overwhelmingly for the SNP, to an extent that the SNP are now asking for another referendum, even though many people who voted for them are voting on the European Union issue. It's a disaster for the Labour Party in Scotland, and it would mean effectively the non-existence of the Labour Party in Scotland if that was repeated at the general election. And it was a very clear judgment there that if you're a Remain voter, you wanted to vote for a clear Remain party. And in London, what that meant was people voted for the Liberal Democrats. In my borough, Southwark, 3 Labour MPs. In the neighbouring borough of Lambeth, 3 Labour MPs. In Islington, 2 Labour MPs, including Jeremy Corbyn. All those boroughs and many more, the Liberal Democrats topped the poll, and the Greens came from nowhere in most of those areas too. People were basically mobile voters were willing to send a message to Jeremy Corbyn anyway. I'll vote for the Liberal Democrats, which Labour people don't normally do, or for the Greens, which Corbyn is the voice of the left in British politics. That's what he stands for. That's what he says he stands for. And yet, people of the left chose to vote for the Greens as well. 2 different ways of sending messages to the Labour Party. That there is, if we go back to my comment about what the European elections say, urban, pro-globalisation or beneficiaries of globalisation, educated, professional, middle class, socially liberal, environmentally concerned voters found they had a Liberal Party, Liberal Democrat Party, and a Green Environmental Party to go to, and they could happily leave the Labour Party. And the Labour Party campaign eventually came down to, if you don't vote for us, you're letting the far right in. And people went, I can vote for the Liberal Democrats and for the Greens, and that's not supporting the far right in any way. And that is part of the 21st century politics. The growing expansion, the expansion of education, of post-16 education, of further education and TAFE, of higher education. It leads to a very different electorate, one which is informed, broadly progressive, broadly liberal, and has a very strong sense of agency and a very, very strong sense of consumerism. They can shop between the parties. And what you see in British politics is a charismatic figure on the far right, probably far right, Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party, a charismatic candidate for Tory leadership, Boris Johnson. Whatever one thinks of him, he could go into any pub, in any working class community in the country and be greeted with a cheer and a pint of beer, as could Farage. And in the centre of British politics, the Liberal Democrats, Change UK, the new start-up party, the Labour Party, even out towards the Greens, there is not a single charismatic figure. Where is the charismatic figure? There's no charismatic leader on the progressive side of politics who can pull those fragments together. Nobody able to take a clear stand, take it to the country, unite those things together to create, a Remain party that would match the Brexit party, that would then be, because look, all British politics is not Brexit. Not all the challenges we face are Brexit, but you can't go round Brexit. You've got to go through Brexit. So somebody needs to take a decisive lead to whether we stay or we crash out. And after that, forming the politics that actually faces up to the challenges that the country and the economy and the society has in the early decades of the 20th century.
It is. I mean, look, it's fascinating because in some ways Brexit is this kind of distraction, and not an insignificant distraction. I'm not trying to belittle it in any way, but Brexit has become this massive distraction for British politics that has taken the attention of everyone for the last, 2 or 3, 4 years. If I was any of these political parties, particularly the mainstream ones, either Conservative or Labor, I would be thinking, we need to handle this and just get it out of the way and get back to traditional politics. I don't understand the strategy with Jeremy Corbyn. Look, I appreciate his background. He's been in the Parliament for a very, very long time. His history, his politics have been very, very well documented, but he's now the leader of the Labor Party, a moderate, centrist, centre-left party that has long held a view about Britain. There is electoral opportunities for the party to, as you say, take that charismatic leadership on this issue and do well. He has a membership base that is that is fiercely defendant of Britain being a member of the European Union. Yet I am baffled by his, like, it's intransigence, or it's his silence, or he's sitting on the fence. Like, if I was sitting in a room with him as a political advisor, I would be saying to him, Jeremy, you need to lead on this. Our own base is looking for your leadership on this. The wider electorate is looking for your leadership on this, and you're being quiet on this. And he's done this all through the Brexit campaign, which I felt like he kind of got away with in some respects. And then you've had the actual general election, and arguably people have said it's been a good result for Labor. They got back in the game. But now, I guess my question is there a view now amongst Labor supporters, I'll get to the membership in a moment, but generally speaking, Labor supporters, they've kind of said, all right, Jeremy, we've had enough of your just kind of playing both sides of the street on this, and we've now just voted with our feet. Will we see a reaction from the party leadership on this in terms of, or Jeremy himself, what has been his reaction really? Let's hear from him. What has he said after the election? Has he come out and said, yeah, I've stuffed that up and I'll be more clearer on this, or is he still trying to play both sides of the street?
So let's start with Jeremy. Jeremy's problem here is who he is. You've mentioned his long parliamentary career, his long career in the politics of the left in the Labour Party. He's caught in a contradiction, which is that his strongest card politically is his authenticity. And his authenticity is rooted in two things which are now in conflict. His authenticity is, I have never changed my view. I still have the same views I had in the 1970s. I am principled, unlike Tony Blair, Neil Kinnock, Shaka Umuna, Liz Kendall, whoever. Anybody else in the Labour Party is compromised, unlike me, I'm principled. Okay, if we take that to be your calling card, we have to then say, well, you oppose the common market, you presumably still oppose the European Union. And kind of that's where he is, and people can see that. People don't know the detail, but voters get that he's uncomfortable with the European Union. Now, he gave it, was it 7.5 out of 10 during the referendum campaign, was his line. And despite that, when it came to the general election, Theresa May framed the general election question as being, I want a mandate for a hard Brexit. That's what Britain voted for. Give me a majority. And the country went, hold on a second, and took her majority away from her and gave Jeremy Corbyn the votes to take that majority away from her. And that was really important. Come back to what that really meant, but that general election was people being willing to use the Labour Party as a vehicle to stop a hard Brexit and maybe to stop Brexit itself. Jeremy took the election as an endorsement of Labour's manifesto policy, which was to respect the referendum result. His problem is his second strand of his authenticity is he stands for the membership. He speaks for the membership. Well, the membership and almost all the unions, affiliated trade unions, want to stay in the European Union because they value the protection of workers' rights. The union movement value the social chapter, the protection, European-wide protection for workers' rights. And most party members and party supporters are big supporters of the European Union. So he's got a contradiction. His authenticity is he stands for the membership, but his authenticity is he's never changed his mind. He's been unable to resolve that, to find a way to say, look, I believe this, but the party wants this, and I will always follow the party. I'm not a leader like other leaders. I'm not like Tony Blair. I don't have my view and impose it on you. I have my view, but you have your view, and I'll follow you. And in my local electorate, a 37,000 Labour majority, which in my period of activism, so just 22 years ago, it was 180 vote, a marginal but 180 vote Tory majority. So now an overwhelming Labour area. Doing door knocking, you got Labour voter after Labour voter all angry with Jeremy Corbyn and all saying, I'm not sure whether I'm going to vote Liberal Democrat or whether I'm going to vote Green. And that's the problem that he faces, which is he can't be true to himself and true to the party. And his strategic ambiguity definitely worked as a strategy for a period. And that, is it Napoleon who said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake?
Yeah.
I mean, the Tories were making so many mistakes. Well, why would you bother to get involved in that? But the campaign strategy of continuing ambivalence and ambiguity into the election was a disaster. It came from the top, and he should take his knocks for that, but he won't take his knocks for that. And I think the interesting thing is how that reverberates through the party. And the second thing, which I think everybody who's listening to this podcast and you yourself will recognise, which is that voting is a habit. And the habit of voting Labour, if you start voting Labour early, you'll vote Labour for most of your life. Promiscuity in voting is a habit too. Once you get the feeling you can shift parties, you don't stop doing it. You start once you've shopped around once, you shop around another time.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the follow-up question, isn't it? So you've had this election. There's been a major swing against the Labor Party in some of its core constituencies up and down the country, not just in London, but across England and Wales and Scotland. And I felt that Jeremy Corbyn's leadership had been protected because of the membership in particular, because there's been attempts in the past for the caucus to try and move on him, and he has managed to stave off those attempts because of this huge balloon of members that have joined the party during his leadership that has kind of protected him. But when he has now effectively gone into an election campaign where he's taken policies that have been against one of the fundamentals of that membership, which is being pro-Europe, when is the tip? Is there a tipping point within the court, within either the membership or within those that actually are close to Jeremy within his inner sanctum, to sort of read the winds of change or get a sense that he is now fundamentally out of kilter with the values of the Labor Party when it comes to the question of Europe? Is there now a tipping point in which people sort of say to him, either the membership or the people close to him, as that sort of quintessential Australian term, pull out digger, the dogs are pissing on your swag? Do you get a sense that there is a shift in attitude by either the membership or those close to him?
So there's already been a shift in the membership, which is there's been a fall-off in membership. People have been leaving the party or not renewing their membership.
But who's that been though, John? Are they the new ones? It is. So it's the momentum type of people that are falling away.
Well, the Corbyn enthusiasts would be a broader definition of it. And we've noticed it. Well, I've noticed it in my local branch meetings, where we used to be a small branch with a couple of hundred members, and only 8 or 9 people came to branch meetings. We ballooned to about 700 members, and up to 30 people would come to meetings. We're now falling down to 400 members, so bigger than we used to be. But we're back down to 8 or 9 people coming to branch meetings, and so that wave of enthusiasm has disappeared, and it has to be said. I mean, look, I'm in an inner London constituency which is gentrified, the electorate that's gentrified massively. It's, I don't know, more reservoir than it is Fitzroy, but it's one in which the people who've joined the Labour Party joined uncivically in the main, with their hearts high, with optimism about change, a belief in the radical ideas and the radical agenda, and they've hit the first barrier of realpolitik, that the leader has actually got some of his own views, and those are very much at odds with their views. And in that kind of way, which is typical of modern politics, but it's typical of modern life, it's like the Amazon response, which is, I don't like this party's lead, I want to send him back. And you can't send him back, you can send back your membership card. And so you're back to the situation where he is unremovable, but he's now at odds with a lot of the affiliated unions. He's at odds with 9 out of 10 of the party members, and he's at odds still with the parliamentary caucus.
How much power, sorry to interrupt you there, John, how much power do the unions still have within the party structures to influence this kind of question about the leadership and the direction of the party's been taken right now?
They still have a huge influence at conference and votes. They could, the unions on the National Executive Committee, they could convene a special conference and they could dominate the votes for a special conference. So they could change the policy markedly on this to pro-Remain, pro-second referendum. It's held at bay because the largest affiliated union, Unite, is led by Len McCloskey, who gives his full-throated support to Jeremy Corbyn, even though his membership are broadly the same as the other industrial unions, which is the membership who work in manufacturing and other areas don't want to leave the European Union. People who work in car plants don't want to leave the union members in car plants don't want to leave the European Union. So the unions could have an influence. It feels though like it's Jeremy Corbyn was impervious to his entire shadow cabinet resigning, his entire shadow ministry resigning. He was impervious to a vote of no confidence by the parliamentary caucus, which is never happened in the history of the Labour Party. And he stayed on because the rules don't explicitly say that if you lose a vote of confidence you have to go. He will stick by the rules and not move. He will not budge, and he'll not budge for all kinds of reasons. He is stubborn in himself, but also the people around him understand that they have no candidate to replace him. There is nobody from the Corbynite left who would necessarily win a leadership election.
How much? There's so much that's happened since we spoke when I was back at the Labor Party working on doing Pot on the Hill. But one of the major spot fires that really happened over Corbyn's leadership in between all of these elections was this anti-Semitism problem that reared its awful, ugly head within the party itself, and then the poor handling of these accusations of countless examples of anti-Semitism directed to Jewish members of the party and Jewish members of parliament within the party. I was over in London last year in the lead up to the local government elections, and I was door knocking in one of the London wards, and I was just talking to some rank and file members at the time, and they were saying that they were really worried about how Labor would go in some of the areas where there are larger Jewish communities because of the way that Corbyn, under his leadership, and the way that the party administration had handled this issue of anti-Semitism that had been flaring away for quite some time. In the end, we saw a whole bunch of really talented Labor Party members of Parliament leave the party and form their own independent group. Just talk us through that and what impact has that had on the party itself, and also losing talented people like Berger and Shaka Lamana. Like, how much of a problem has this caused the party itself going forward?
So the anti-Semitism scandal is one of the most shocking things that has happened in my lifetime in the Labour Party. I last year went to a demonstration organised by the Jewish community against the Labour leadership. I never envisaged when I joined the Labour Party I would ever demonstrate against the Labour Party leadership, and particularly with the Jewish community against the Labour Party's handling of the anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party. And it's got to the point where the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a very powerful human rights and equality body that was created by a Labour government, it is investigating the Labour Party for institutional racism. Now, the only other political party it has ever investigated is the neo-fascist British National Party. And when you think that the Labour Party is now in the same category as a neo-fascist, thuggish, street-fighting party, you have to really wonder how we got here. And the answer is Jeremy Corbyn's politics are why we're here, for a range of reasons. First, Jeremy Corbyn's political formation is from that part of the far left which is anti-American. Everything they believe in is anti-American. Everything America supports is wrong and they're opposed to it. America supports Israel. Jeremy Corbyn supports the Palestinians. He supports the Arabs in the wars, but he supports the Palestinians. Now, all sensible people in the Labour Party want peace and a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine. But the anti-Israel position is morphed into anti-Semitism, which is disguised very badly as anti-Zionism. But the fact that people say I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. Zionism was the nationalist movement for the Jewish state of Israel. You can't be anti-Zionist without being against the Jewish state of Israel. And it's not the state part that you're against, it's the Jewish part that you're against. And so that formation of the left is one of them. The second one is, in my view, that part of the left has always had alliances with elements of the left which have drawn from Soviet communist ideology, caricatures, language around Jewishness and anti-Semitism. The tropes of Soviet communism stayed and lived on the left, and when Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters said we have no enemies to the left, they opened the door to those kinds of people to come back into the Labour Party or to come into Labour for the first time. They brought with it their ideology and their views. They're also anti-Semitism. Now, the fish rots from the top, as the old Russian proverb goes. It's because of Jeremy Corbyn and his politics, people in the Labour Party, you have to have boundaries on your left as well as on your right political party, because the Labour Party does have enemies on its left. All Labour parties have enemies on their left. Undemocratic people who do not believe don't share our values. And I think the final thing I want to have to say is the left is haunted by conspiracy theories, and they're everywhere. The othering is a major part of the far left. The attacking the 1% is the thin end of that othering wedge. Like the politics of Britain, Australia, America, France, Germany. There is not some hidden class way somewhere who, if we could only find them and get rid of them, we'd have equality. There's not a conspiracy of business. Conspiracist theories bleed into each other, and the conspiracist theory of capitalism leads into conspiracist theories of Jews running the world, anti-Semitism, Jews have all the power, Jews control the money. There's a set of those tropes that they go back to the 19th century. And Jeremy Corbyn says he opposes racism in all its forms, and then appends anti-Semitism to that. But underneath it all, there's a feeling on the left in British politics that you can't discriminate against Jews because they're powerful. Discrimination is against the powerless, and therefore anti-racism is one thing, anti-Semitism is quite a different thing. And Jeremy Corbyn also, to be honest, comes from the poorly educated English northern classes. So it's class formation in itself. Son of vicar, really bad at school, no further education, intellectually uncurious, a man whose closest comrades say had never opened a book or read a book in his life. That kind of man, he speaks at times in the cliches of the right Daily Mail when he talks about, one speech he said, the Zionists should learn to fit in, should learn an English sense of irony, and like accusing Jewish people of having no sense of irony is missing the point. That irony is the Jewish thing. It's a concatenation of it's all of these things together. They add up to a crisis created by Jeremy's leadership, which he never responded to swiftly enough. And a day after Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's former spin doctor, says he voted Liberal Democrat in the election, he gets expelled from the Labour Party. There are still people waiting for a reply on whether people who've been anti-Semitic members of Labour Party members are going to be investigated. It tells you where your priorities are. Punish and play out, it's fine, because you really care about that. Punish an anti-Semite, draw a boundary there, not so much. And, Luciana Berger is a good friend of mine, a good colleague of mine, a comrade. I was really saddened when she left. I could not possibly have argued her out of doing that. I think it was brave of the Change UK Labour MPs to leave to join Change UK. It's such a wrench to leave a party. I'm still a Labour Party member, but I can feel why people could believe that on this issue they should break with the Labour Party. On the issue of Europe, they should break with the Labour Party. The Labour Party feels like a very, very fragile coalition at the moment. And have Change UK made any impact? Probably not. And that, I think, is because to be successful as a new party, you need to win every single time. Not just that, you have to roll the dice every time. It's every single step of the way is an existential challenge for you. You have to win and win and win and win and win. And sometimes even when you do that, Mr. Break what the party did in the 80s, you can win and there's no lose. It's very hard to break through in the two-party system in the United Kingdom. Any two-party system is very hard for a new party to break through. But they have at times they have looked brave and principled, and at times they've looked like the Keystone Cops. Everybody knows, everybody who's ever been involved in electoral politics knows the one thing you have to do to your candidates is vet them. And when you've done that, vet them again. When you've done that, vet them again, then get them into a room with you, eyeball them, and find out why they're lying to you. Because you are only as strong as your weakest link. And the Change UK, one of their candidates defected to Liberal Democrats while still standing as a candidate. Another of them had to resign because of tweets on social media, and so on and so on. So if you're going to do this, it is high profile, it is high risk, it is high stakes, and your effort has to match all that. And it hasn't. But what it has done is create a reaction inside the Labour Party, and Deputy Leader Tom Watson, he prevailed on a number of MPs, some people say up to 40 MPs, prevailed on them not to leave and join Change UK. But as a consequence, he created a new discussion group within the Labour Party, within the Parliamentary Caucus, a discussion group of around 140, 150 MPs. So he now sits within the caucus with a group which will be decisive in deciding, in the end, what happens to the Labour Party as things unpack over the next period. Because push beyond, but if there were to be a general election, there could be a minority Labour government. That minority Labour government could be one that's committed to not just confiscation and expropriation of private assets like shares in nationalised industries. It could also, and of shares in British listed companies, it could also be committed to radical changes to taxation of companies, which would crush one of our biggest sectors like the pharmaceutical industry. a big employer and a big innovator globally. So there are a set of really visible policy and political conflicts. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't believe in NATO. What if, as is entirely possible, there's a conflict with a NATO country, either Russia and one of the Baltics, or Iran and America, and Article 5 NATO, the mutual self-defense clause, is invoked. Does anybody seriously believe that Jeremy Corbyn, as Prime Minister, would put British troops into defend Latvia against the Russian Federation, or to defend America against Iran? No. Do people believe that the working class and middle class of Britain don't want to see that happen? No, of course not. So we're in this situation where we have this I don't know. I mean, Brexit is like a sponge that takes up everything. It absorbs all the bandwidth of politics, and yet just over the horizon, there's the real prospect of a Corbyn government, and the real prospect of genuine conflicts, tearing conflicts that will make some of the disputes about leave and remain pale into insignificance. It's a fundamental dispute about a socialist economy and the disregard for the rule of law and property rights is a genuine thing, and that it's going unargued in the Labour Party and unarticulated, but it's sitting there in the policy. So it feels, just as it feels that the Tory Party got this existential crisis because of the fight from their fringes, which is dragging them to the right, and it's been playing out in the leadership election. The Labour Party has an existential crisis because from its fringe, which is currently its leadership, and those tensions are unpacking, because that's what happens to tensions. They don't go away, they're not resolved, they eventually unpack.
Before we wrap up, and the thing is, there's so much for us to talk about, but I just kind of want to get a couple of thoughts on just a couple of quick topics that we didn't cover. Even just like one or two word thoughts. Scottish National Indie Ref number 2. What's the likelihood of that happening before 2022?
It seems unlikely, not least because the SNP legislation is to give them powers to have a referendum. It's not actually a confrontation. I think the SNP want the second referendum as a grievance. They could say they're not allowed to have it rather than actually wanting one themselves. And no Tory leader will let them have one. And actually, it would be their worst nightmare to have one now, because support for independence is actually is at an ebb. It's still, still in the 40s, but the opinion polls suggest it's not in terms of voters are.
Who is the likely candidate to be the new leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister of Britain?
Boris Johnson.
That's it? Just Boris Johnson, that's the man?
After a beating that takes them to below 10% single figures in elections, every Tory MP will be looking at their majority and going, how safe is my seat? And everybody in politics knows, never stand between an MP and their seat. They will do anything to save the furniture if they think it's their house that's on fire.
And last one, likelihood in order of preference of these things happening, a second referendum on Brexit, Brexit just happening, or continued intransigence on the matter for another 2 years?
The most likely thing in reality is Fudge, because that is a very British solution. Keep on kicking the can down the road. We may be talking about Brexit for the rest of my political career, but still have decades to run. I hope. And so I think Fudge in the end, because there is no majority in Parliament for a referendum. There's no majority in Parliament for leaving without a deal. There's no majority in Parliament for Theresa May's deal. and there's no willingness on the part of the European Union to renegotiate. So in those circumstances, the most likely thing is continued debate about this with a longer extension. However, the smart thing to do would be to revoke Article 50, which would then, if you were a Tory, if I was Boris Johnson, I'd revoke Article 50. I would say we're staying in the European Union, we still want to leave, but the offer you gave us was so terrible, we're going to keep coming to all the meetings, we're going to be part of the European Council, we're going to come to the ministerial meetings, we're going to make your lives a misery, we'll still pay our bills, we'll do all that, but we are going to act like squatters in your property until you are desperate to pay us off, and you give us whatever we want to leave. And I think that would be a smart thing to do, unlikely to happen, because the Tory party are wisely once described as the stupid party, and they really have been driven utterly mad by Brexit. So they can't think strategically on this anymore. They simply think tactically.
John, you've painted an incredibly bleak picture for us Australians watching from far away, but an honest assessment, which is why I love getting you on to talk about this sort of stuff, because you're always very candid in your appraisal of what's going on, and we appreciate your time to come on to Socially Democratic and have a chat to us today. We had so much more to talk about, but we're just going to have to leave it for today and get you back on again. I want to talk to you about Brexit and the implications in Ireland and a whole bunch of other things, but it's been great having you on today. Absolutely. John, thanks very much for your time, and we wish you the best of luck, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.